rather restricted to a micro-scale analysis. So you could say it's kind of caught between a high level of conceptual abstraction about socio-materiality and different forms of agency and a kind of low level of empirical range. It's been criticized also for marginalizing overarching power relations, although this is disputed by many of its advocates, and for an inadequate distinction between human and non-agents. Also, rather disturbingly from my perspective, for discarding historical factors and tending to overlook the change in the longue durée. So if I sort of reflect back on those when I was starting the book, it became apparent to me that although each of those approaches had a lot of advantages, and you could write a history of Berlin just about path dependence or just about transitions, none of these approaches capture the fullness and the complexity of 100-year long-term analysis of a single city. So when I was writing them, I was looking at ways of exploring the work involved by different actants in stabilizing or adapting these socio-technical configurations. I was considering conjunctions of continuity at the same time. I was not trying to privilege the dominant systems, but looking for alternatives, hybrids, non-linear trajectories, and so on. And also, I was trying to introduce a historical angle on assemblage research, what I called historicized assemblages. In the following bit, I'm going to give you some examples of what I mean, referring to the Berlin case and referring just to energy. So the first point the finding I had was that obduracy and transformation are not mutually incompatible, even in a single socio-technological configuration. And as perhaps a rather provocative example, let's look at the National Socialist era. There was, of course, a lot that changed in 1933. We saw a lot of political dismissals of utility personnel, the subjugation of municipal to national goals, of national autarky, and as gradually a militarization of the infrastructure. But equally, there was no strategic reorientation of urban energy and water infrastructure. There was no new strategic plan developed after 1933, even though the Nazis had criticized municipal utilities continuously beforehand. The investment plans for sewage treatment plants and power stations and all the rest were simply continued. So we need to be sensitive, I think, looking broadly, to combinations of change and continuity at any one place and time. So rather than looking and trying to identify whether infrastructure is in a condition of stasis or a condition of transition, seeing that there are different elements of these systems pulling in different directions at different speeds at the same time. The second finding is a focus on stability as the default setting or on moments of transition can miss long-term processes of de- and reassembling. And here's a great example, which is the trajectory of a very simple hire purchase scheme buying electrical appliances called Electricima that was created in the mid-1920s and went on into the 1960s. And if you just looked at the scheme itself, which is basically allowing people to buy hire purchase household goods, which was funded initially by the power utility of Berlin and paid back in installments with electricity bills, basically the system continued for those 40 years, but it was put to very different uses during those 40 years. In the mid-1920s, it was used for promoting electrification in households. By the 1920s, when they were not able to provide enough electricity for this, it was directing consumption away from peak times with what you can see here, nighttime storage heaters, nighttime water heaters. In the early 1930s, during the Depression, it was used as offsetting the dramatic drop in industrial power use by encouraging household consumption. And in the late 1930s, it was used by the Nazi regime to reserve the war effort. How did they do that? It was about promoting the sale of electric fridges to keep food fresh longer. And in the 1950s, it was resurrected to showcase consumerism in West Berlin competing with East Berlin. So illustrating here the need to unpack these processes of reconfiguration and above all their contextual framing. The same artifact may have very different meanings in different contexts. Third point, non-linear trajectories are not aberrations from the norm, but are often characteristic of socio-technical systems. So you see in Berlin, for example, sewage gas that is now being heralded as something very new, very sustainable, and very green was actually very prevalent among many German cities in the 1920s, and particularly in the 1930s. So it emerged then and disappeared after the Second World War when it became tarred with the political brush of Nazism, since the Nazis had promoted that so strongly as part of their national autarky campaign. Or energy storage technologies, energy flexibility. We'll like to think we've invented that now, haven't we? Because it's all about the energy transition. No, there was a lot of energy storage technologies going on from the 1920s. You see an image here of a steam storage plant in Berlin that was operative until very recently. And in the 1980s as well, West Berlin was very distinctive for having a problem providing electricity. So you saw down below, you can see a 4-story building that was just chock-a-block with electricity batteries that was built in the 1980s. So we need to be open to deviant and discarded configurations beyond the dominant system, because that creates openings when we're thinking about the future as well. We can build on things from the past. The fourth lesson is building on that, is that infrastructural palimpsests of the old and the new are the norm. They're not the exception. A palimpsest is one of those pictures where people paint another picture on an existing picture. So this process of layering the new on the old. Interesting example here is the emergence and coexistence of district heating alongside coal and later gas-fired heating. So the coal and gas-fired heating does not disappear, but continues to exist alongside it. Or the continuation of gas street lighting in Berlin alongside electric lighting. Why? Because West Berlin had its own gas pipes well into the 1980s, works well into the 1980s, and needed to balance its gas supply during the night. And what's interesting about this layering of the old and new, it's that only historical analysis can really reveal this layering, this hybridization of the old and the new, which is so important when we think about phasing out coal today. And finally, there are multiple temporalities that coexist in a single socio-technical system. So while we like to think of long-term trends, we're familiar with these graphs about increased electricity, gas, and water use during the 20th century. Berlin's experience shows that these were interspersed with very strong short-term dips in demand during the Depression, during the post-war coal crisis, during the post-1961 population drop in West Berlin following the building of the wall. So we need to heed these breaks in the curve, basically, to think about what a change in the curve might mean in the future. Or another example would be the long-term planning for infrastructure expansionism, this great ambitionism that was very present in the 1920s and echoed into the post-reunification era of the 1990s with some really quite striking similarities. So the lesson here is that the categories of the past, the present, and the future that we love to think as being very distinct are actually in reality often fuzzy, and their interdependencies are often indisputable. So there is a lot of the past that is embedded in the present, but also a lot of futures that have been conceived in the past as well. So let me come to my final point here, which is about mobilizing usable energy past. And I've cited quite a lot from Ben Sovacool already. So here's a quote from one of our other keynote speakers, Sheila Jasanoff. The past is prologue, sure, but it is also a site of memory excavated and reinterpreted in the light of a society's understanding of the present and its hopes for what lies ahead. Great quote. So with my book, I took a long time span approach to Berlin's infrastructure history, and it revealed diverse, dynamic, and unexpected trajectories of technological urbanism. It revealed infrastructural hybrids of the large and the small, old and the new, the de- and reassembling to accommodate political and economic change. It revealed legacies that continue to shape socio-technical configurations today, such as the dependence on fossil fuels in both parts of Berlin, such as the legacy of massive infrastructure expansion and overcapacity after 1990. But it's also a corrective on selective infrastructure histories, as those told by these wonderful linear trajectories told by engineers, civil engineers, or incomplete infrastructure histories. So the way we like to avoid, circumvent uncomfortable histories around state socialism or national socialism. So usable pasts, which are a kind of form of productive remembering, are a way of trying to mobilize these interesting histories. And this is my final slide, where I just want to show certain ways that sort of emerged out of some entry points that have emerged from my work on history of Berlin. One is definitely about path dependencies. Here we need to think about how minor decisions in the past reinforce structures and practices over a long time. But it's not just about path dependencies. Critical junctures, looking at how crisis events in the past can reveal phenomena otherwise concealed by the patina of familiarity. Don't be frightened of the exceptionalism. It can be quite revealing. Non-linearity, looking at how development trajectories are often more messy, more fluid, more unmanageable than we are meant to believe, than conventional narratives suggest. Past alternatives, looking at how and why alternative socio-technical pathways were not taken. That can be really instructive. But also instrumentalization, how selective histories, as I've argued here, are used to promote particular interests and deflect attention from others. And yesterday we heard a wonderful example of that by Sarah, talking about the colonial narrative and how it was excluding focus on other people and other people's experience of infrastructures. And finally, then, echoes of the past, how ideas reverberate across time, being taken up, dropped, or perhaps adapted to contemporary needs. And let me conclude on that note, saying if you're interested in ways of mobilizing the past to inspire infrastructure futures, you might be interested in a series of short films that I produced, filming the production of my book. It's communicating ideas around the book and meeting contemporaries as well. And also a very recent online workshop where I trace the line between the former Berlin and Charlottenburg, looking at different sites of infrastructure and talking you through the exciting and enchanting political histories of those infrastructures. And on that, I will stop. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Tim. I sent you the applause from all the rest of the audience because this is not possible for you to hear it, but it is there for sure.
Thank you. I had one person anyway, so that's good. That's better than none. Yeah.
Okay, so you can type your questions on the right-hand side in the chat, and all the speakers, they can ask the questions directly. Just turn on the microphone, and Jörg started already, and so we can start with Jörg's question. Many consider infrastructures to be scripted, for example, containing the central streams of modernity. Is your work suggesting that these scripts are actually very multiple and can be read in very different ways by current non-users? Your approach then is about keeping the palimpsest visible to maximize the option space for possible futures.
I think that's a great way of putting it. The final question about being aware of this palimpsest and seeing what kind of layers are underneath. I think the idea of energy infrastructures being scripted, certainly in the notion of the designers, the people who are responsible for them, whether it's the municipal officials, whether it's senior engineers or utility directors, they would like to think that it was well scripted. And initially, obviously, there was a design, there were these strategy documents, and it was about rollout of that. Well, what I'm saying, as time proceeded and these systems underwent different political but also economic transformations, as consumption also changed, or the policy context changed, these systems were often not exactly reinvented, but rejigged, reconfigured, and set up in a different way. So you have like an electricity system in Berlin that was originally created, obviously, to provide electricity. It was very much provided at the time to enact the new unified Greater Berlin. That was a very important part of it. Of course, by the 1950s in West Berlin, it was about sustaining the insular city. That's what it was all about. Or in East Berlin, it was about the need to overcome municipalism, tiny localism, municipalism, by connecting this powerful East Berlin grid to the national grid of East Germany and showing what the city could provide for the rest of the country. So these things get twisted, turned by those actors as well, and not just by historians in retrospect. So so I hope that answers that question to some extent. But your final point is really good, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Then Martin has a question. Martin Wolsing, he said, great presentation. Then your point, I think on the last slide, is about unmanageable development of trajectories. What is your conclusion about the policy claims on transition management?
I think there is a need to be humble on the one hand, so not promising too much, and are not promising what they call in Germany der große Wurf. Yeah, so the great leap forward, as it were. Yeah, so that's on the one hand this notion of humility, the need to respect the variety, the inability to control these systems, even the people who think they're in control. There's some great examples in Berlin of the kind of these systems being uncooperative commodities in Karen Backer's words. But nevertheless, the variety, the richness that you can see in these systems, particularly if you don't just see them as physical artifacts, but obviously as socio-technical configurations, the richness there offers huge amount of potential for building on. Yeah. So on the one hand, it's kind of rather perhaps a rather debilitating notion that they're not as controllable as one would like to think. But on the other hand, if you look carefully, I'm sure in each city, if you look carefully, you'd see a lot of these deviations, this fluidity, this contingency, and so on. They provide a huge amount of potential for traction, for seeing alternative pathways and building new alliances around them.
So as there's no one using the opportunity to asking a question, I will use the opportunity. Tim, perhaps by combining your talk today with a presentation of Ben yesterday, because he also talked about history, and he examined the duration of singular energy transitions in national energy transitions processes, changes within one kind of technology, and how is it from your conceptual perspective, from this perspective of multiple temporalities? Does this perspective of Ben make sense in your way of thinking and conceptualizing the past?
Do you mean multiple temporalities or multiple energy systems? Yeah. Okay. I think part of my criticism of the transitions literature and also of LTS, that despite the rhetoric about it being socio-technical, it is still initially driven by interest in technology. So they're looking at a technology or an infrastructure system, how it got established, or they're looking at a new technology, whether it's nuclear or whether it's combined heat and power or whatever, or renewables, for example, nowadays, and how that's, and looking at the sort of social, institutional, political dimensions around that. And that's, of course, preempting the technology, as if the technology is the sort of preemptive issue of interest. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying it's a partial perspective on that. And I was deliberately trying to avoid that sort of prioritizing the technology there. So I could have just sort of followed certain technologies around Berlin and looked around that. And because Berlin lends itself to looking at the politics, because the politics is really so much in your face, you can't overlook that. It's in all the archival material, all the stuff there. So the idea, so you're confronting those, I say maybe the interesting way of saying that is you're confronting those kind of familiar linear periodizations of large technical systems. You're confronting those with turbulent political histories and disruptions of a city, of 20th century Berlin's history, with all the shifts from Weimar to the Nazi Germany, the Cold War, division of the city, reunification, all the rest. Yeah, and that really sort of puts the spanner in the works about the notions of a sort of continuous linear trajectory, and gets you thinking about different kinds of trajectories, different kinds of periodizations. So although I did write my book in a chronological way, I'm always looking for the ways in which certain dimensions of infrastructure cross-cut certain regimes. And that example of the Electrissima is wonderful because it is so consumer-oriented, and it cut across three very different political regimes, from Weimar to the Nazi regime to West Berlin. So hopefully that answers that question to some extent. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's another question from Abdullah. Again, thank you. In one of your slides towards the end of your presentation, you list path dependence, critical junctures, nonlinearity, and so on. How do we as researchers ensure we don't overlook all these important things? Or can we? With which theoretical frameworks and methods? Thank you.
Okay, well, I guess this is sort of pressing at the idea of what is Tim, what is your overarching theoretical framework that you're now sort of all this time criticizing these other, or not, well, criticizing, pointing out their weaknesses and so on, and then you come up with sort of conjunctions of continuity and change. I deliberately did not sort of establish some kind of alternative conceptual framework, because I was trying to get this case to speak to the theory, yeah, and saying, if you look at this case, and you will see all sorts of limitations to conventional ways of conceptualizing continuity and change. And of course, it doesn't mean that you will have to look at all those points that I listed in that final slide. It's a kind of indication for future research. So some people might be very interested in looking at those past alternatives. I think that's absolutely fascinating. Others might be very interested in the sort of selective histories. How is, that's what Sarah was talking about yesterday. And those are kind of pointers for future research, and that's how I describe that in the final chapter of my book. So don't feel the pressure to need to do that. But equally, I didn't feel the pressure, to be honest, to come up with some kind of alternative conceptual framework. But I wanted to show where I'm coming from and where I think there's really interesting work can be done in the future.
Okay, there are no other questions, so let's continue. Thank you very much, Tim, again, for your presentation. Thank you for the questions and answers. So let's continue with our next speaker. And I'm delighted to introduce Jana Cabanova from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And at the same time, she's a visiting fellow at the Stiftung Wissenschaft and Politik in Berlin. And Jana, you will tell us something about energy pathways, and the history here perhaps also plays a certain role. So right. Jana, the floor is yours.
Okay, so you can see the presentation, right? Everything's fine? Yeah, super. Hi, welcome to my presentation. I'm really excited to speak here. I am presenting part of my PhD project. So the global energy transition is hydrocarbon-rich latecomers, contested future energy pathways in Russia. What you see on the first slide, one is the picture of a wind turbine produced by the Russian nuclear state corporation Rosatom. And then on the right-hand side, you see just the logo of hydrogen development plants by Gazprom, which I'm sure you know is the state-controlled gas corporation in Russia. So going to my research questions, basically I started from a puzzle. Russia is a very hydrocarbon-rich country. It's an energy exporter. It has very strong carbon lock-in. Why does a country like Russia choose to develop clean energy? And here in the presentation, I will focus on solar and wind, but also to some extent on low-carbon hydrogen, which is a new trend right now. Who are the actors and advocacy coalitions driving policy change in this area, and what motivates them? And here, maybe also, what kind of future do they imagine for Russia, for Russian energy system? And how do these coalitions influence policy change? A word on my theory. I decided to choose MOC, a policy called Advocacy Coalition Framework by Sabatier and Weibli, and to go quickly over some key concepts: policy subsystems, unit of analysis, and advocacy coalitions. What is actually meant by it? It's all actors. It could be industry representative, government officials, experts, NGOs, who share common beliefs about a certain policy area and who coordinate their actions. That's very important in the attempt to influence the decision-making process in line with their beliefs. So they want to translate their policy beliefs into action. There are usually not one, but several advocacy coalitions with differing beliefs and different resources. So policy beliefs are very important. Some of them are core, they don't change, they're very entrenched, and some of them are secondary, maybe what is the best way to implement a certain policy. There are also resources. Resources could be a lot of things. It could be, of course, money, material resources. It could be influence and connections. It could be information, anything that helps you in influencing the decision-making process. And then policy learning is also an important concept. Basically, coalitions learn from policy. Importantly, however, if they see facts, how you interpret them is based on your beliefs, right? I mean, if you see, for example, now that the power crisis in Texas, so if you're a hydrocarbon supporter, you say, oh, look, it must be the renewable energy that's failing in Texas. Look, we are right not to do it anyway. But of course, that's their interpretation, which is not really correct. So, and here's just a quick picture of the ACF flow diagram, just quickly. On the right-hand side, you see the policy subsystems. They're competing coalitions, A and B. Each has its own policy beliefs and resources, and they try to influence the decision-making process. On the policy subsystems, it's their stable parameters, or it could be also external system events like climate change, or maybe the discussions on introducing the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism. It's a huge thing in Russia. I think it's the #1 topic in Russia that's discussed the whole time. My data sources, it's a process, but I'm conducting semi-structured expert interviews with the help of 2 assistants, document analysis, and I think in the age of COVID, actually a silver lining of this pandemic has been that I'm able from my room in Berlin actually to attend conferences, workshops, discussions in the parliament. It's really crazy. I mean, it's very transparent. So you have the videos. It's a great new resource. I'm very thankful for that. Even though I had to cancel on my field research, this is very nice. And I'm trying to do data triangulation. So for context, so what do we have in Russia in the electricity generation? You see, basically, there's a lot of natural gas. Russia is one of the leading natural gas producers worldwide, so it's the main fuel. Then there is a good share of nuclear and hydro, coal, not so much, but stable. And then if you see this black line at the very bottom, which is kind of, well, that's solar and wind, that's less than 1%. So you can see there is still a long way from an energy transition. And what is very important to remember is that Russia is developing clean energy, but of the domestic decarbonization agenda, and I cannot emphasize it enough. Climate and decarbonization plays no role, at least has played no role until now, in any attempts to develop wind and solar or to develop hydrogen. Not yet, due to the global changes, but it hasn't been the case. So, for example, in the energy security doctrine, climate change efforts, mitigation efforts are seen as a challenge and kind of like a threat to national energy security. Has ratified the Paris Agreement. But if you actually really look at it, the pledges reduction of 30% of the 90 level by 2030. But actually, because of the downturn of the Soviet Union, in 2019, Russia was already at 52% of the 1990 level. So it has fulfilled its pledge by default without any effort. So actually what they mean is that would be an increase of emissions from the current level, because you could have like up to 70 by 2030, now you have 55 or 60. So it's not ambitious. There is a draft of the law on carbon regulation, but it's really watered down. And the Russian energy ministry actually don't have an issue. Russia's power mix is one of the cleanest in the world. Why? Because we have so much nuclear, we have a lot of hydro, and we have natural gas, which is the cleanest fossil fuel. So that's not a driver. So let's look at case 1, renewable energy development. So it really was born in the industrial technology community. So the main goal is to localize production of renewable energy technologies and preferably to export them. If you look at the systems, it's really industrial and technology policy and the electricity sector. However, it should be said that it's not a typical industrial policy case. I mean, really typical industrial policy case would be, okay, Russia is really important. We need CGT, combined cycle gas turbines, so turbines, and Russia imports them from abroad. It's a security risk. So if we could manufacture it, which is Russia is trying to do, that would be a huge thing. But there was a marginal group outside of the energy ministry that said, okay, let's see if Russia maybe can do something else just than exporting raw resources. That's why this coalition emerged outside of the energy ministry, because what does the energy ministry do? It actually just wants to strengthen Russia's position as a global energy supplier, that's all. And this man, Anatoly Chubais, is really the face of Russia's renewable energy, the main advocate, the main driver. Known better in Russia for being the architect of the privatization in the 90s. That's why he's disliked very actively by a lot of people who blame him for the falling standards of the Soviet dissolution. So he was head of the policy, and then he introduced the market principles there, or tried to. So he said, let's build up this technology cluster in renewables with his corporation that he had at Rosnano, Russian Technology Corporation. Then there was an oligarch group, Renova Group, and actually what they wanted to do is produce solar panels cheaply in Russia and to export them to the EU in order to take advantage of the feed-in tariffs like in Germany back in 2009. But then of Chinese competition and all of that didn't work out. So they said, okay, let's produce them and sell them in Russia. And then a later entrant was Rosatom, the nuclear state corporation. They are seeking technological diversification. And they also have a lot of production facilities that are not used to all capacity, so they want to say, oh, we can try something else. And then later, Fortum and Enel, that are present in Russia, joined in. So the circle of the renewable energy is very limited. What are the coalition beliefs? It's really that Russia should move away from exporting raw materials. There's this very famous phrase that Russia is the raw material appendix of the West. That's seen as very disturbing, that Russia shouldn't do it, and that Russia should avoid technological dependence. And the goals was to create a cluster. The policy output was basically, in 2013, this support mechanism, which had very, very high local requirements. The market size was small, right? Because why should we have a lot of renewable energy? Very good power system that's supposedly one of the cleanest in the world, and modernized natural gas. So they only planned for 5.4 renewables. And the costs for this mechanism were borne by large industrial customers. Here's just a table to show you the localization rates. So you see in wind power stations, because by 2020 it should be 65%. So the equipment 65% should be produced in Russia. For solar, it's up to 70%. For hydro, 65%. And that's of course a big limiting factor for investors who want to come to Russia, because they have to prove, in order to be eligible for payments for this guaranteed rate of return, they have to prove that up to 65%, let's say, of their equipment is manufactured in Russia. And if you look at the mechanism, you see then who will be against it. It's of course the larger industrial consumers, because the mechanism is paid through the wholesale market. It means they pay higher payments on the wholesale capacity markets. Basically, they finance this transition. And their policy beliefs is really that the rise in energy costs is detrimental to the Russian economy, to the competitiveness. It should be avoided at all costs. Renewable energy is fine, but it's competitive. It shouldn't be benefiting, like the industrial consumers shouldn't be paying for it. And right now it's very much coming to the fore due to the discussions of the prolongation of the support mechanism until 2025. So all these, and this is, for example, one of the representatives of the let's look at the market, RE market. We just have an oligopoly, just a few companies that don't really have competition. They have no incentives to lower costs because they're guaranteed payments of 12% over 15 years. And basically, our technology with the West is being entrenched. We are falling behind. And this very shortly, I thought, mostly I work on renewable energy, but hydrogen is such a topic lately. So I thought it could be an example of a nascent systems. It's only recently joined the agenda in Russia at the intersection of energy policy, transport policy, and innovation. And I think here you can see really the difference. So if renewable energy was seen like as a marginal thing that we don't really need it, we already have a lot of spare capacity in the power system. Okay, maybe it's good if we try to manufacture equipment, maybe sell it to the export it later. But hydrogen it really fits in with the path dependency and with the economic model as it is now. So Gazprom, the gas exporters, they say, okay, the global demand for gas is falling. So what should we do? It would be great to use our gas to produce decarbonized hydrogen. So basically the same model, just with a different energy carrier in a way. And because it fits so much better the logic of the economic model that Russia has, that's why you see the key players actually more prominent, like Gazprom. So it's testing this new technology to produce decarbonized hydrogen. It's trying to convince the EU that they should buy it. And Rosatom has a more maybe complicated motivation because it doesn't have its own gas, right? It's a nuclear company. So it wants to produce hydrogen through electrolysis and sell it to the West or to Japan, but it's also a technology transfer. And the debate right now in Russia is, what kind of future do we want? And so some people say hydrogen for export is a great opportunity for us to stay relevant as an energy supplier. But other people say, look, are we still fulfilling the same role? Are we just staying stuck in this role of providing resources? Okay, let it be hydrogen for the West. Isn't it time to stimulate our technological development, our domestic demand for clean hydrogen? So I would say these are the two emerging coalitions, different in their policy beliefs. And they say let's try to use hydrogen in the transport sector. Let's try to use it in isolated Arctic areas where it could be used for energy storage, because you cannot really have power lines there. Let's develop the hydrogen supply chain. And because it's a nascent subsystems, what you have is that the actors are trying to get to know the intentions of each other, trying to find ways to coordinate, but it's still an ongoing process. Whereas in the renewable energy, which has been developing since at least 2013, the roles are much more clear by now, and the coalitions and the positions and the main arguments are also much more clear. So just to conclude, I would say that, yeah, for me it was interesting. So Russia, the discussions on the future of Russia as an energy power are very, very present in Russia today. Because I think of the EU Green Deal, of the global climate change agenda, and there are ideas. I think renewables don't have a lot of supporters in Russia because it's just seen as too difficult to do, that Russia's system is so locked in the system that was created 100 years ago. But hydrogen is seen as a new opportunity. But here again, the two competing versions of the future, whether we're still supplying resources or whether we're trying to do something technologically, are still very much present. And so I think for me, it's been very interesting to observe how that is playing out, and this very future discussions are happening. Yeah, so thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Yeah, Jörg again is clapping his hands. So this is the applause from all of us, Jana. Thank you very much for your inspiring presentation. So, yeah, and more virtual claps from the audience. So,
thank you.
Are there any questions or comments for Jana? Not yet in the... there's the first one from Jörg. What about the spatial dimension in Russia? It is a vast country that would lend itself to decentralized RE solutions, but it comes from a centralized political tradition. So thinking carbon democracy, how is energy infrastructure used to control this vast territory?
Jörg, this is an excellent question, and that's of course also discussed in Russia quite a lot. So what I would say is that what you see right now, the kind of renewable energy development fits very much with the model of the centralized energy systems. Because where do you build, or where have been built this wind farms and solar parks? It's actually as part of the main in this population heavy region. It's kind of the same logic. It's just that you have a wind farm and not like a natural gas plant. But what you say is Russia has a lot of areas that are far away, that are isolated, and it says, yeah, actually renewable energy is a good idea to develop there. The problem there, and it's being done, it's starting to be done. The problem is that these areas have very little population. So if you just use renewable energy to develop, to supply those areas, basically you don't have a demand. And the main goal of developing the cluster would be completely impossible, because if you have, like, I don't know, 1 million people living there out of a population of 140, okay, it's probably a different number, but still, you get my point. You just don't have enough. Like, if you have to keep in mind that the goal was industrial policy. The goal was to create a technological cluster. And actually, it would make so much sense to develop solutions there, but that wouldn't address the main goal, which is to create production technologies. I mean, it's really about this local content requirements. It would be all possible if you import good solutions to provide for these people. So, yeah. This chat is scrolling, so I can...
Yeah, okay. The next question is from Zachary. He says, it's nice to hear renewable energy studies on Russia. That is very little covered. So tell us more about interviews, and how did you choose them?
Yeah, I actually have two countries. One is Kazakhstan, which is also an oil exporter. There it was very easy to approach people. In Russia, I had to cancel all my field research in 2020. But I think what I found very good assistance. But what was easy to do, I think, is Russia's renewable energy market is very contained. I mean, it's not many actors. So actually, if you go to a couple of conferences, them, you know who the actors are. So it's the main investors. It's maybe 3 or 4 companies in the wind and then in solar. Equipment manufacturers, it's again not many of them. Then regional authorities in a few regions that were really supportive of hand clusters based in their regions. like Ulyanovsk Oblast, where Lenin was born on the Volga. And there are some enthusiasts who try to promote this decentralized solutions, small scale renewables. There are those, but they are not really supported. And of course, the government is like more to approach. But I think by now there's so much that's available in terms of their statements and arguments online at different conferences that even if I don't get to interview them, I feel like I have enough material. So it's been working out much better. And I think with COVID, people are somehow much more open to being online than I was fearing. So, and I think I was also I'm starting to review companies that are trying now to buy green energy to decarbonize themselves. It's usually exporting companies responsive to the pressure from the West.
Yeah, there are some questions related to this because Dorothee Apfel asked, can you elaborate a bit more on the power relations on Russia? Perhaps other regions, as you said, and players would benefit from renewable than the current big players. And Lisa asked, are there renewable energy cooperatives in Russia comparable to the EU? So
okay, there are no renewable energy cooperatives. Just to get that out of the way. And relations in Russia. Well, I mean, you can see now if you look at the development of the sectors, why solar started developing. There was an oligarch who was interested in it, and because there was Chubais who wanted to have some development in Russia, so they joined forces. They got like some loans to them, some support, and then they were able to have this program. They lobbied basically for the support mechanism. So you can see that connections mattered because renewable energy was not on the agenda at all. I mean, it was not important that Russia should do. And, or for example, if you have regional authorities, I mean, it's a good case for them, no? Like if you're in Ulyanovsk Oblast and you say, I don't have to invest anything, but then the federal government comes and helps us set up a technological, so I have new production in my region, I have taxes, I have new jobs, it looks good, it's good for the image, I'm seen as attracting investment. So some governments were forward-looking, and so they grasped the opportunity. And then, of course, I think it really helped that there were these foreign corporations with presence in Russia since early 2000s, like Fortum, who decided also to buy these assets. So that helped. And in the end, the key players are usually not some startups, not some new companies, but really established players. I mean, those who can have influence. Also, so what is clean hydrogen? Yeah, clean hydrogen, in Russia's case, of course, the idea is to produce it mostly from natural gas by decarbonizing it. It's possible if you do CCUS, carbon capture or storage. And there's this new technology that Gazprom is developing called methane pyrolysis, basically that you produce hydrogen from natural gas and solid carbon. So not CO2, not the gas, but solid carbon that you could store, transport, you can maybe utilize economically. But it's not economic yet. I mean, it's just an idea.
And perhaps you could give an answer to Rafaela's question, because it's adding to Vert's question. So she asked, is the focus really on hydrogen from methane pyrolysis? Oh God.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, the focus is on hydrogen from natural gas, basically. So it's considered decarbonized or low carbon by, there's this certify EU scheme with a certain threshold, what is considered to be decarbonized for hydrogen. And so it could be with CCUS or pyrolysis if they develop this technology. Or, I mean, Rosatom would be happy to use electrolysis from nuclear power, right? Called, I think, yellow sometimes or pink hydrogen. The problem is to find the takers. I mean, the EU, I think, is more skeptical about it, but Japan might buy it because then it's low carbon. I mean, it's from nuclear electrolysis. But of course, it's a lock-in. I mean, that's exactly why Gazprom and Novatek are interested, because it's a way for them to use their natural gas and to sell again. I mean, to continue the model. And the green hydrogen was not discussed for a long time. Now I think they're starting because they're seeing the attention from the West. They're saying, okay, maybe we should try it from some wind power facilities. Rosatom is a big player in the wind market. So they are thinking maybe we can use some of our wind parks to produce green hydrogen as a pilot project. So there's some discussion on that, but that's just starting.
And then Abdullah says, in one of your slides, you mentioned that Russia has other motivations for renewable energy development. One was diversification. Are there more?
Diversification, and I think there was this idea that look, like we don't need it, but look at what's happening in the world. So we cannot just completely, we cannot then in 10 or 20 years have to import everything from abroad, all the equipment. So we have to have our own production, our own technology. And the idea first was really to export it rather than to use it internally. But then that, of course, is not so possible with the Chinese competition and everything. But there are some visionaries who are pro-climate. They're just not very prominent, or their views are not so prominent. And they're saying that Russia managed to jump in the last car of the train that's leaving. So the train of the energy transition that's leaving just barely made it and created some kind of technological competences in this area. That's what Tugas always says. But again, decarbonization has not been part of the game, but I think it might change maybe because of the external pressure in the next years, but it hasn't been the case. Yeah.
Yeah, then we have two questions related to bioenergy. Martin Wolsing says, because of Russia's lock-in to fuels from climate change policy perspectives, a huge danger is that biofuels will be embraced as prime renewable source. What does your study find about this? And then Sakari asks, how about biomass industry? Yeah. And because Hilmar Salonen studied bioenergy, and it seemed to be a sector driving renewable energies intake in some Russian regions.
To Martin, I think I see your point, but I think that's really not happening. Biofuels are not seen as attractive. It's not really a discussion in Russia right now. And in general, biomass is not, like, it's not really supported. So if you look at the support mechanism, it supports solar, wind, and small solar. Biomass doesn't really benefit from any special programs. Some oblasts, but really one or two, not many, have experimented with that, but it was the imported equipment was too expensive and difficult to find. The whole market was somehow not developed, and so I'm surprised because I think Russia has a much greater potential in biomass, but it's very low key. I mean, they're under the surface, I would say. So I'm happy there was someone who did research on that, because it's not even discussed much at all. I think part of that is that the people who did the renewable energy development, they were very much power sector oriented. I mean, it's also heating, and so the whole renewable heat, it's not really an issue in Russia. It's not really discussed in Russia so much. Maybe they were really focused solar, these two things. Also, the first movers were interested in that, so it hasn't shown such development yet. Maybe that will change. Who knows?
So, thank you very much, Jana. We learned a lot about Russia's energy
Thank you for your question.
Transition today. And this was really interesting, because normally we don't talk about Russia when we talk about energy transition. So thank you very much, Jana. Then before we continue, just a short reminder that please, all of the speakers, turn off your camera when the others are talking. Then we can continue from Russia to Mexico. In Mexico, it's early in the morning, and I'd like to hand over to you, Itzel Torres. Itzel, you are there? Yeah, perfect. Perfect. Itzel is from the Humboldt University in Germany. And also a very warm welcome to your co-author, Professor Jörg Niewöhner from the Integrative Research Institute on Transformations of Human Environment Systems. Thank you for being here in our virtual room. Itzel, the floor is yours. We don't hear you, Itzel.
Oh, sorry. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction and welcome to my presentation. Today, I would like to share with you the main points of our working paper, The Future That Wasn't, Stalling the Energy Transition in Mexico. Our goal is to engage deeper with the ways that energy transitions are imagined and understood in Mexico. And I think the Mexican case shares similarities to the Russian case that Jana has just presented. Here, we are going to discuss the possible transition pathways that are embedded in 4 discourses. The new extractivist, led by the current government, which has a renewed focus on hydrocarbons, and 3 discourses that have emerged as a response. Our methodology consisted of review of policy documents, institutional reports, and press. I attended events organized by the civil society and private companies revolving around the challenges of the energy transition in Mexico. I conducted 24 semi-structured interviews with key energy stakeholders between February and May 2019. Some background about Mexico. It is located here, right next to the US. And in 2020, the population was over 120 million inhabitants. It was the 13th oil producer, and it also has important natural gas reserves. Despite this, as we can see in the graph, exports of oil have decreased, imports of refined products increase, but as we can see, imports of natural gas have dramatically increased. Natural gas is mainly used for electricity generation. About 50% of the energy matrix is made of natural gas. The main electricity consumer is the industry. And here we argue that the energy transition was enabled by the alignment of energy markets, energy technologies, and energy policies. In 1920, Mexico was the second largest oil producer in the world. Oil was exploited by 17 foreign companies, but disputes between Mexican workers and foreign oil companies led to the expropriation of oil in 1938 and the creation of Pemex. Similarly, the next year, the electricity sector was nationalized and CFE was created. For over 70 years, the power sector was dominated by Pemex and CFE. There were attempts to reform the sector, but without success. However, that gave room to limited participation of private companies and laws to promote renewables and the energy transition. It was in 2013 that the energy reform took place in the oil and electricity sector. The energy reform would imply a transition from a vertically integrated industry dominated by CFE and Pemex to a decentralized market, focusing only on the electricity sector. The reform will allow private participation in electricity generation. However, CFE would hold its monopoly for transmission, distribution, and power supply. The energy reform compels CFE to obtain the electricity at the lowest possible cost. Therefore, CFE would buy electricity directly to private entities through long-term electricity auctions and public-private partnerships. CFE would also enter into contract with private companies to build new transmission and infrastructure. Here it's important to mention that clean energy in Mexico includes non-renewable sources and fossil fuels as long as they meet some sustainability criteria. There is a complete list of sources and technologies defined as clean energy. A series of laws derived from the energy reform, including the General Law on Climate Change, which stipulates that by 2024, 35% of electricity should come from clean energy sources and 50% by 2050. It also includes ambitious goals of reducing 22% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and increase distributed solar generation. 3 auctions took place. They were open to the whole country and all technologies, but solar and wind drew international attention for the low prices. For example, one of the solar bids in the 3rd auction was $17.7 per megawatt per hour, lower than auction prices in Chile and the Emirates. In 2018, a new government arrived with a different vision of the power sector and attempted to reverse the changes that the energy reform entailed. The first thing was to cancel the auctions, and I think the statement of this public servant captures the new government stance. She argues that their assessment of the energy reform is that it's a failure because it handed over national resources to private companies without benefits to people. CFE and Pemex were bled dry, and the promised investment didn't arrive, neither the jobs promised in the industry, because these companies arrive with their personnel and don't create value chains. It is this reading of the energy reform as a failure and sold out to foreign companies that now serves as the central argument to restrain Pemex and CFE. A narrative of energy sovereignty and national development legitimates investment on existing energy facilities such as coal and fuel oil plants, and also the construction of a new oil refinery. This strategy fits with a general trend in Latin American countries that have been labeled neo-extractivism, which refers to post-neoliberal policies of apparently progressive governments and is based on the appropriation of nature through extracting and exporting raw materials and social programs targeting vulnerable groups, which are financed through the revenues of extractive projects. Here, we identified three main discourses that emerged as a response to this controversial project. We identified the discourses and relate them to actors and institutions. However, one actor might support more than one project to a greater or lesser extent, but we want to show here what is at conflict on this debate. The next discourse is the transition fuel. It is supported by members of national and international organizations, business, financial institutions, and energy magazines. As mentioned before, about 50% of the energy matrix accounts for natural gas, and it was partly influenced by the low prices of US gas that CFE started this conversion of thermal plants to combined heat cycle, and is currently the predominant technology in Mexico. Back then, CFE discussed in forums the idea of an energy transition using natural gas. However, the debate now is that we may have an energy matrix ready for the transition, but we have entered in an energy security issue. Supporters of this project acknowledge the investment that Mexico has made on natural gas infrastructure, and they claim that it is a more desirable option to fossil fuels such as oil or coal. Some experts discuss nuclear as a breakthrough clean energy technology, but as elsewhere, the country has polarized over the use of nuclear energy. All in all, in this discourse, a low-base fuel is required. The next discourse is the neoliberal. It is supported by members of international organizations, business, and financial institutions. Here, the supporters highlight that Mexico has abundant natural resources and the country doesn't even need fossil fuels. Here also they claim that renewables don't depend on geopolitical issues and price variations that could compromise access to fuels. The cancellation of auctions is seen as a barrier to achieve climate change and clean energy targets. Therefore, they're urged to resume auctions. A co-benefit of renewables is the jobs that would potentially be created in the industry. And even though Mexico is a latecomer to the transition and relies on foreign technology, an industry of wind and solar has started to grow. The final discourse is the prosumers. This is supported by public servants, academics, members of financial institutions, and members of national and international organizations. Here, the main argument is that distributed solar generation the citizens can have more direct benefits as power producers and consumers. In this vision, the prosumer is more aware of their energy consumption and impact on climate change. An advantage of distributed generation is that it generates on site and doesn't depend on transmission and distribution infrastructure. Distributed solar generation has growth in Mexico, but only among high consumers. For instance, companies advertise it as solar energy paying the consumer's electricity bill. According to experts, electricity subsidies is the main barrier to increasing distributed solar generation. Mexico maintains electricity subsidies via tariff to households and agriculture. Experts in this group discuss the Bono Solar program, which is a proposal made by a number of organizations to replace electricity subsidies with financial support to households for the installation of panels. But so far, the government hasn't taken up this proposal. We took an energy democracy approach to analyze the four discourses and ask for whom and by whom this transition is. The four discourses focus on the economic advantages of each project and the need to satisfy an increasing energy demand, but without questioning for whom we need to produce that much electricity. As we see in the graph, only about 22% of electricity is consumed by the residential sector and about 60% by the industry. And yeah, there may be more specific energy-intensive industries. The neo-extractivists and the neoliberal have an extractivist vision of natural resources, ignoring the social and environmental impacts of extractivism. The neoliberal and the transition fuel focus on meeting clean energy and climate change targets. And while climate change is our main environmental challenge, we also face environmental crises such as deforestation, biodiversity loss, ecosystem destruction, and so on that come with this kind of projects. The prosumers and the transition fuel offer a solution to energy access problems, but little is mentioned on fighting energy poverty. Finally, the neo-extractivists and the prosumers show how legal framework may support or become an obstacle to democratize renewable energy. So if this story look already complicated and these discourses are at the national level, on the ground the story is even more. This case is a company that plans to install a solar park with an installed capacity of 70 megawatts. The project has already resulted in deforestation of more than 200 hectares. And the residents of the municipalities nearby sued Ginkgo Solar for violating their rights to prior consultation on projects that affect their livelihoods. I hope that in the near future, I can present the findings of my current fieldwork. Thank you very much for your attention.
So now, thank you very much, Itzel, for this presentation. And you, again, I send you our applause. So there are already questions in the chat. First one from Stephanie. It is exciting to observe the privatization of the public energy sector. What are your thoughts on electrified mobility? For example, electrified public transport and electric cars in Mexico?
Yes, thank you for your question. And this is also something that the experts, for instance, discuss, that electrification of the public transport, for instance, is not even discussed yet. It has not been promoted. So as a latecomer to the transition, I think the main focus was to increase the share of renewables, but these sectors have been ignored in a way.
Mm-hmm. Then a question from Tim. How far does the post-2018 government policy differ from the pre-2013 position? What has happened to the advocates of the 2013 reform initiative? Are they now part of the neoliberal discourse?
Well, I suppose that the beneficiaries of the 2013 reform are the ones that are more affected right now, and those are private companies, especially the ones who won the auctions before. And yeah, I mean, they are part of the neoliberal discourse, but as I said before, private companies have also interest in other sectors such as oil and gas, or even solar panels at the individual level. So yeah, actually there is a big debate right now. And yeah, I would say that there is a tension between the current government and the private sector.
So then I would like to ask a question. Why did you decide that this energy democracy thing, energy democracy, perhaps also energy justice, is not a discourse? Because it was not one of the four discourses. So is there not a fifth discourse related to civil society, NGOs, or also to movements on the ground against these large-scale projects and so on? There may be perhaps a fifth one, but I don't know. You know it much better.
No, I didn't include it as a discourse. I included more as a way to analyze these discourses, because even NGOs, for instance, promote distributed solar generation, but that is only at the individual level, because the current framework doesn't allow community energy projects, for instance. So I wanted to show how, despite these discourses promote renewables, for example, there are still some things missing, and it's to make the power sector more democratized, right? So yeah, I wouldn't say, but now that I'm in the field, perhaps I'm seeing more that is an active participation. And yeah, perhaps in the near future, I can include a new discourse, or probably contrasted to this for discourse.
Okay, then Klaus has a question related to the relations among the discourses. He asks, is the neo-extractivist discourse a populism-driven discourse? And is the prosumer discourse a middle-class, elite-driven discourse? And are there relations between them?
Yes, as I mentioned before, the literature talks about neo-extractivism in Latin American countries with a progressive government, or apparently a progressive government. And the prosumer discourse, I would say, is more middle-high class, as middle or low class don't even have the opportunity to install solar panels. So of course, like you need to have you need to put an investment to install solar panels. So I would say it's more middle and middle high class. And are there relationships among the discourses? Do you mean like the 4 discourses or between these 2 discourses? Because yeah, I show in the presentation the relationship between the 4 discourses. Sorry, it's here. And it's that the 4 of them focus on the economic advantages and increasing the energy demand. So they show the benefits of each project. And I would say like the main tension between the 4 discourses, it is whether it should be state-led or market-led, the investment and development of these projects.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Right now, there are no questions in the chat. So I think it's okay, there's one. Dorothee Apfel. Is there a public discourse about energy justice?
Yes, there is a public discourse, but I'm just, let's say I'm doing fieldwork right now, and this public discourse is on the ground, and at least it is on the specific areas. For instance, I'm right now in Yucatan, in southeastern Mexico, and it seems like there is a strong energy justice and energy democracy discourse in this area. It might be because 9 of the 18 projects awarded in the first auction correspond to projects to be built here. So the projects started to take place in this region. So of course, there is a mobilization of NGOs, academics, and so on to a more justice transition.
Okay. So there's still time to ask questions. Yeah, and Dorothee asked, but are there any local people involved in this?
Yes. So the members of these NGOs are local people, and also there are indigenous organizations that are like basically at the front of this energy justice and justice transition.
And Jürgen, this is not a question, this is a comment, right? Production and consumption regions are at odds. He wants to say something. Jörg.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to support Itzel's argument that from what seems to be emerging from the fieldwork, at least we've been talking about this, is that there's, I guess, a common split between where the energy is meant to be produced and under what conditions, and who actually consumes it in the center. So we've recently been talking, which I thought was interesting, about these different ideas of development that are implied in sort of urban and largely touristic centers and in the rural regions, which are of course meant to be the producing regions for solar power, etc. So that's an interesting sort of backdrop to this entire debate. Just to add to that.
And this would also be a parallel development to Germany, right? Because we also talk about this split between production and consumption regions in our energy transition. Okay. So there are no questions left, but it's thank you very much. This was a really stimulating talk, and we had a lot to ask, and there would be much things to discuss. Perhaps, for example, when comparing Russia and Mexico would be a really interesting thing. So the applause is for you. Then we can switch to the next speaker. From Mexico to India and Germany, as far as I know, a warm welcome to Katja Müller from the Martin Luther University in Halle in Germany. And we hope that it will work with, with the microphone and so on, and the video. Martin Luther University in Halle, Germany, and you will tell us something about spatio-temporal politics. We are happy to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I resist the question whether everything's working. I guess everyone can just adjust the slides to fit your screen as you like. Thanks, Ludger, for the invitation and the kind words. My talk is, as you said, entitled The Spatio-Temporal Politics of Energy Production, and it actually draws on two research projects that I conducted together with a team at the UTS in Sydney, but technically being employed in Halle. So these two projects are the Coal Rush and Beyond and Decarbonizing Electricity. And I'll try to conceptualize the spatio-temporal politics of energy production through comparing the spatial context and temporal politics of protest applied in processes of planning and setting up energy production in India and Germany. So I'll first go to take you to the Coal Rush and Beyond project, where we worked as an interdisciplinary team from political economy, anthropology, global history, and journalism, and looked into coal reliance, climate change, and contested future. Because at the time that we started this research in 2013, 2014, there was a big coal rush going on. Coal extraction and burning has been booming, and we analyzed this coal rush in socio-political terms. We asked how coal reliance emerged and whether it might be superseded. We investigated social conflicts centered on new coal facilities, so pretty much when mine extensions were on the agenda or new coal mines were about to be opened, and analyzed what social factors may enable transitions from coal. The three contexts that we looked at were India, Australia, and Germany. And we compared them to develop a nuanced understanding of coal. And this, please, excuse me, this is the commercial block now. Our findings are laid out in the book that we published last November. And one of the main arguments is that the four poles of the coal industrial complex, the coal development nexus, the timeframes, and renewable energy production are closely intertwined, and each pole needs a critical attention and a reordering or scrutinization in order to move towards a low carbon energy future. So looking at the timeframes now in particular as one of those poles, I'd like to zoom in on India and Germany. In India, we worked in Chhattisgarh as a region, and you can see here on the map roughly where India is located in the central eastern part of India. We worked here over a period of 3 years, ethnographically on the ground, although I have to say that it's quite complicated to do that in India. It's more challenging due to national regulations, especially if you come from an outside university, or even worse, are associated with environmental NGOs that we cooperated with in India. We still conducted participant observation, informal conversations, established trust. Deep hanging out as a practice is quite important. And we also did interview recording for media outputs as well as policy analysis. As regards the findings, I'd like to quote Alok Shukla, whom we interviewed in 2015, saying, quote, "For Adivasi, the law is the moment between birth and death which allows us to take a breath." And he means pretty much that fights over land, comprising forest use for Adivasi, India's indigenous people, versus industrial coal mining, are done for large parts on the basis of legal struggles. So there are two foundations for that in India. For the Adivasi, for the indigenous people, it is important to rely on the PESA, the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act, which pretty much mandates everyone who wants to acquire land to consult the Gram Sabhas, the village councils, and seek their approval. So that's one thing. And the second thing that they rely on is the recognition of the Forest Rights Act, which is a legal mechanism for recognition of rights for forest-dwelling communities, giving them access rights, settlement rights in common forest land, and also some rights of ownership and management. But these rights do not mean that they get absolute ownership of all forest. What emerges from these two acts is a partial and complicated bricolage of rights. And in practice, you also have to notice that these rights are implemented partially at best. So eventually, we do have a lot of legal fights and challenges in front of courts as regards forest clearance, as regards the granting of licenses to mine. But these legal challenges are eventually, and here we come to the chronopolitics involved, causing delays. So these struggles are a present-oriented form of mining temporalities, to refer to De Angelis term, and they can extend the procedures of mine planning extensively. Such politics of legal delaying, for example, stretched the processes of this mine, the PEKB mine planning, to 5 years. It started with declaring the forest where it's situated a no-go area for mining, but then turned to clearance permissions being granted in 2011, then challenging this decision in court, interim approval of coal extraction, and still until today, this particular mine is in a state of contestation. It has been up and running, but the mine extension is again under scrutiny. So here we see that the kind of exemption that we have, because coal mining and forest dwelling can't live together as such, results in a form of protest as regards a delaying politics. Moving to Germany, we looked in Germany at the Lausitz in Brandenburg and focused in particular, it might be a bit small, but you might get an idea on the very top right corner. You see in kind of like neat, clean lines, the Jenswalde Nord mine extension that actually affected 3 villages that went to the list for devastation. So what we found here was a politics of waiting, a different mining temporality, which focuses on the present and the future. The politics of waiting, or the mining temporalities, started in 2007 with the mining company and the state of Brandenburg announcing the mine planning, implicating thereby an excess of coal time that defines the perception of time in this area. And the perception of time is then closely related to bureaucratic times. We have quite strict and highly regulated mine planning in Germany in place, where 6 to 10 years for the mining approval is quite normal. So local people tried to deal with these temporal settings. After an initial shock, they channeled this shocking moment into agitation and activity. They started to organize marches, protests, a popular petition, and also a referendum. They tried to what Felix Ringel calls tricking time. They went with the time frame as set by the mine planners, just tried to unsettle it whenever possible. And they were in the first place quite successful with the marches, protests, and the popular petition, raising media attention. But then they got stuck. In 2008, opposition became a form of preserving. The referendum didn't work out, and protests turned into responsive and repetitive forms. The sign of stuckness and waiting, which Gassan Hage also describes quite nicely, always implies a hierarchy, a power relation between the one who lets someone wait and the one who has to wait. So this is a form of temporality where the intertwinement with dependency and power plays out quite prominently. And there are several forms to deal with that waiting, but here, in this particular case, I argued that people turn this into a form of waiting it out, into a form of brave endurance. And how did they do that? They related the time frame of coal mining, as implied by the state and the mining company, to alternative timeframes. And one of them was waiting for technological development, and the other is the national or even international politics of climate protection. So embedding their local situation in medium-term context of energy production development and the long-term context of global warming provided them with the possibility of transforming their feeling of stuckness into waiting as a brave endurance. And you might know the results of this protest. They were taken off the mining map in 2017, and the Jenswalde North mine extension is off the radar. Looking at these two forms of kind of where coexistence is not possible, these two forms of exemption will now turn to decarbonizing electricity. And I'd like to introduce two cases where we, in one case, have a spatial coexistence, and in the other one, not quite. We investigate now with that project how legitimacy for renewable energy can be won or lost. We again focus on India, Australia, and Germany, but slightly different states, South Australia, Karnataka, and Brandenburg again. And we again use ethnography combined with social and political analysis to understand what can be done to enhance the transition to renewable energy. Again, taking you to India first, we looked at the Paugada solar power project, which is part of the Indian government's initiative to expand the renewable sector. They have a target of 175 gigawatt capacity installed by 2022. This has already been ratcheted up because it has become so cheap to produce solar energy. International investments also flocking in. So the Paugada solar power project is one of the largest solar parks in the world. It comprises 4,900 hectares, 5 villages, and they have now 2,000 megawatt installed capacity. And as regards time, we see here pretty much just a swift planning and setup procedure. The project was announced in October 2015, and land lease agreements were done in less than 6 months, comprising 1,422 landholders. And any one of you who has been looking into these processes of how to acquire land, that's just incredibly fast. So all the 2 gigawatt have been installed and connected in less than 4 years. The first 100 megawatt went to the grid or were connected to the grid in 2017. So all in all, it was such a swift project where you have to note that renewable projects in India can go without environmental and social impact assessment approval. So there's no need to do that. And the second thing is also that the state legislation was amended to automatically enable the rezoning of agricultural to industrial land for the purpose of solar park development. So the conditions as set by the government were quite beneficial for a swift process. After this swift connection, however, issues arose. This is a comparatively arid era with several droughts over the last 5 decades. And it was scheduled for the solar park, but still there's agricultural farming going on. Of the 10,000 people, almost half are involved in agricultural labor or agricultural farmer. And again, these 5,000 people are divided into landholders and landless laborers. And you can do the math, of course, renting out your plots to the solar production companies is quite all right for the landowners, but the landless laborers are just pretty much stripped of their income at all. So that causes severe problems and is recognized by all people living there. There is corporate social responsibility in place, and the government also has a financial aid plan, but that both of them have not been implemented as of now. This takes us to the German case study in that project, where we looked at wind in particular. And wind, other than the other 3 examples that I showed you, is actually characterized by coexistence. So in general, it's possible to have energy production, residential living, and agricultural production in close proximity to each other. But this spatial advantage over coal mining or solar farms has been vanishing, which is, as we would argue, also due to the spatial regulations as a form of energy governance. So we have a spatial planning with assigning wind suitability areas, and this is a form of concentrating energy production in one place, which might lead, as some might argue, to a decrease of the number of affected people, which is true, but overall, it leads to an increase of protests in general. And as we found out, it's not so much that people on the ground are against wind energy in general, or that NIMBYism is at play, but people are against the increase of density. They are against the number of wind turbines and the height. And this actually relates to the talk that we had as the first one yesterday. Height really becomes a problem, and the kind of concentration of wind in one locality, because people just get their feeling of having had enough, of bearing too much of the burden. And this then leads to a colliding of timescales or of chronoscapes, as Christopher Clark calls them. We have here 4 timescales: bureaucratic time, climate time, and the temporal agendas of the wind companies and the citizens. What do I mean by that? In detail, we have climate time, where we need to speed up the energy transition process in order to meet climate targets and to keep global warming well below 2 degrees centigrade. But at the same time, we have a bureaucratic time, which makes these processes of approval and development of the energy transition ever longer. So the wind park that we examine and accompany in detail started planning in 2019 and is very unlikely to be connected to the grid before 2025. So the wind companies, for them, it becomes quite difficult. Calculations become more speculative and insecure when they stretch across such long timeframes. And that, of course, also influences spatial politics, because wind companies take to wide planning and other forms of speculative work. And the last expansion of this time frame then comes through citizens who apply a temporal politics of prolonging the process through interventions. So people play for time, they try to prolong decision-making processes, and they speculate on economic investments running dry. These 4 examples now demonstrate actually that there is no straightforward unilinear relationship between space as regards coexistence versus exemption and the applied chronopolitics, at least since coexistence is also socially constructed. Of importance in the imagined energy future, be it fossil fuels or renewable energy based, so of importance are the imagined energy futures and how these futures are being worked towards through national agendas. So when we look at these 4 cases again, I'm not going to go into detail about other factors that play a role, like civil society versus political society, that we have, especially when we look at India. And I'm also not going to go into more detail as regards the timeframes that can align and timeframes that can collide. But we do definitely see that chronopolitics, or ways of tricking time and dealing with time, come out here in 4 particular ways. So first, when the coal development nexus is still strong, but the climate state nexus is slowly kicking in, legal grounds are actually a means for politics of delaying, as we've seen in the case of coal in India. In the same context, renewable development can move rather swiftly, potentially supplementing the coal development nexus with a renewable development nexus, which is with a strong climate state nexus and a diminishing coal development nexus. You can opt for waiting as regards fossil fuel, as we've seen with coal in Germany. And with a strong climate state nexus, you can opt for politics of delaying for renewable energy, but that is mostly varying on investments running dry. And we also have to note it does not relate to climate time, as such chronopolitics are directly related to the spatial politics of jeopardizing the advantage of coexistence. So with this brief overview of the temporal politics, their relation to the energy futures and the spatial conditions, I'd like to end and invite you to share maybe your chronopolitics as they relate to your studies and experience, or to ask questions as regards these projects.
Yeah, thank you. Chronopolitics and spatial temporal politics in our discussion. There was already a first question from Nomzamo, and he asked the question, how is a water energy food security nexus affected due to mining in Germany?
That is an interesting question, which I'd have to think about. I mean, I have not been working on the water energy food nexus, so I can't tell you much about that. I mean, I can tell you that water, of course, is an issue when you look at mining, because it usually means that you have to pump all the water in order to, not have the mines flooded. These are open cut coal mines, and that causes issues that mostly farmers in that area, as well as environmental NGOs, bring to the agenda. But with food production, that's a totally different story for Germany that I don't think makes a lot of sense to go into now. But thanks for the question.
Then Juliane Haus had a question. Thanks for the interesting talk. Katja, can you tell us more about your theoretical framework? Is it comparable to Tim's approach? Now it's a way of historicized assemblage.
I guess I could look into Tim's approach in more detail and see where the overlaps are. I can tell you for the coal mining, we definitely looked also at the kind of historic entanglements of coal and why they are actually so much relevant today. So you have to look at the history of coal mining in order to understand what's going on today and how people are arguing for an exit or for the continuation. You always have to look at that in the particular timeframes that it is now in, right? So if we looked at coal mining before 2019 in Germany, that's definitely a different thing than looking at it now. And even with India, I mean, they didn't schedule any kind of coal exit, but they're still on that agenda. If we have to go for an energy security, that means investing in coal mining, allocating new coal blocks, importing coal from Australia and other countries, as well as investing in renewables, which, as I said, have become cheaper and cheaper and also draw a lot of international investment. That makes a lot of sense to see the kind of historical entanglements as relates the coal industry and the state, as relates also identity politics. Historicized assemblages, I'd have to talk to Tim about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Then Tim himself asked a question. How do you factor in contingent events, sudden shocks, into your analysis? How did proponents of particular timeframes respond to these?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the most obvious example that comes to my mind is, of course, I just briefly mentioned that initial shock in 2007, when people got that letter into their mailbox that they'll be on the map for devastation in Germany, and then that they channeled this into activity, into protest. So they swiftly, again, formed citizen initiatives and organized. And the same happens to some extent in India, but here we have to take into consideration what I just briefly mentioned, that the civil society in India is not as strong as it is here. So we mostly have a political society in India that draws on various alliances centered around big men. So players that sort of have a patronage, are embedded in a patronage system. So that shock, or these moments of shock, can be channeled as well, but the dynamics are to some extent different. Yeah.
Okay, Jana has also a question related to India. Does India have local content requirements in the solar and maybe wind sector? If yes, do you see it as a success of the industrial policy? Does the Indian public feel that the energy transition is creating new jobs?
What is local content requirement? I have to ask.
Local content requirements.
Yeah, sorry. It just means basically that a certain percentage of the equipment that's used in solar projects has to be manufactured in the country, has to be manufactured in India. Like to produce the socioeconomic benefits locally.
Interesting question. I don't know. I really don't know if they have these content requirements. And as all that I know is for the construction, they do a lot with the World Bank and the international companies. So like the Paugada Solar Park has been financed mostly there were reverse auctions, and it's been mostly international or large-scale Indian companies, like really big-scale Indian companies like Adani and Tata, who could set these solar parks up. I'm not sure if the equipment is manufactured in India or abroad. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay, then to Germany, Jörg says or asks, in the German case, do you consider the delaying through planning a matter of bureaucracy in the somewhat politically innocent sense, or is this clientelist politics?
Clientelist politics, meaning. Sorry, I mean, yeah.
No problem.
But these are people who can actually.
Meaning certain prime ministers, for example, protecting village identity, to put it bluntly.
No, not exactly. Well, I mean, the cases that we work with, where people opted for delaying, and this is as regards renewable energy, whereas, compared to waiting for coal mining. So I guess we refer now to the renewable energies. It is definitely a matter of bureaucracy, yes, and on various scales. So having talked and worked with the Amt, the Bauamt, there's definitely politics of delaying there already, maybe not consciously. Then we have regional planning, where again, these procedures are just extended, and we have not come across the cases where actually village politicians said, we do want to have an identity politics of local villages in this particular area. It's more that they have been kind of confronted with negative experiences in the past as regards the economic sphere. So meaning pretty much that in Brandenburg investments comes from out of state, and that the way they these large-scale companies kind of argue or interact with local stakeholders is not always on eye level. Yeah, I'd say that more than clientelist politics, where one PI wants an identity saved. Especially Brandenburg is an energy country, it's an energy state, labeling itself as this. But yeah, I'm not going into details with my encounters with the Brandenburg Prime Minister a couple of years ago. Too much coal for my liking. Yeah.
I have also a question related to this, because you said that concentrating the wind farms would increase the protest in general. So you think that there would be less protest when there wouldn't be a concentration of wind farms? When spreading it in the whole landscape, then there would be less conflict?
I don't think it's just this one factor. I don't think that it's just spreading it spatially would all of a sudden take away all the protests. No. But you have to take a couple of factors in. And this is definitely the way that people interact, political interaction, political decision-making, also the processes of when are people involved. That's usually at a point of time when it's already, too late. Public hearings, so to speak. And the economic aspect is also quite relevant, I'd argue. The Brandenburg government just has installed last year, no, there's 2 years back already, that form of financial participation, where every community is supposed to get 10,000 euros per year for every newly installed wind turbine, which is, one way to deal with the recognition that there are some things, hierarchically uneasy with the way spatial, temporal, and economic factors play out. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Then there are still 2 questions left. One is related to Australia. So do de-invest strategies in the financial market play a role with regard on Australian coal mining? At least I've heard this estimate by Schellenhuber a few years ago. Do you know anything about this? Can you help Klaus Seibt?
I'm not, well, see, the thing is, Ludger asked this question whether whether innovation and ex-innovation kind of interrelate. We also had with the coal rush that that argument that coal mining always relates to renewable energy development. So we have to maybe see that in the two kind of interlinking things. So we have de-investments, maybe, yes, but we also don't have a national strategy for renewables in Australia in place. So all that's taking place in Australia is on a state level. That's why we also chose South Australia. That is a state that has been developing renewable statewide renewable energy strategy and really pushed forward. And that goes along. I'm not sure whether this is international de-investment, but the closing down of important coal mining related industries in particular areas led to this. So there is this interlinkage definitely between innovation, ex-innovation, and I'm pretty sure also related to financial dimensions. But whether this clearly falls into the category of divestment, not exactly sure.
Okay, and then one last question, very general one about German situation in Germany. Are we moving towards zero carbon or net zero carbon future in Germany? Is there any taxonomy put in place which should be adhered by all sectors in transitioning to a low carbon future?
Maybe. Hopefully. I mean, I'm not looking into the glass bubble here. But you know, net zero carbon again is that whole complicated issue. Whether that actually, and you know, looking at various states, we've already heard that, you know, even if we reach net zero carbon, then the mess is just elsewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, we are quite successful in the electricity sector with more than 50% now renewables in the grid, but when it comes to mobility and heat and so on, there are many things to do in Germany. So we cannot yet say that we are moving towards zero carbon or net zero carbon future in Germany. So no questions left, and it's 10 minutes past 1, so it's perfect. Thank you for everybody. I didn't have to use these numbers, so it was perfect, and it was really, really interesting. All the 4 presentations, all the 4 discussions. So on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank all the speakers for their stimulating presentations and for the discussion, contributions, and questions. So, and now I wish you a very wonderful afternoon at your home. So, and we will continue the session on Friday at 10 minutes past 11. So see you and have a good time.